LifeAudio.
Howdy and good morning there, friends and faithful listeners, and welcome to the Bible Explained on this lovely Monday morning. I am so excited that you're here to start out the week nice and strong by reading some Bible with me. We're going to be talking about pride today and the story of King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles 26, one of the prideful kings that tries to become a high priest. All right, faithful listeners, we'll get into this topic in just one second. Here's a message from a sponsor real quick. But while this is playing, this is a great opportunity for you to grab your Bible out of the version that you prefer, and also your cup of coffee or your cup of tea to share with me. So while this is playing, go ahead and do that. All right, faithful listeners, let's go ahead and read the entire chapter of 2 Chronicles 26. It's kind of a long chapter, but there's a lot to talk about in Uzziah's life because he reigned for quite a long time, actually. Interestingly enough, he was one of the longest reigning kings in Judah's history. So let's go ahead and read this together. I'll be reading from the World English Bible, or the WEB version. All of the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the place of his father Amaziah. He built Eloth and restored it to Judah. After that, the king slept with his fathers. Uzziah was 16 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jechiliah of Jerusalem. He did that which was right in Yahweh's eyes, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the vision of God, and as long as he sought Yahweh, God made him prosper. He went out and fought against the Philistines and broke down the wall of Gath, the wall of Jebna, and the wall of Ashdod, and he built cities in the country of Ashdod and among the Philistines. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians who lived in Ger-Baal and the Meunim. The Ammonites gave tribute to Uzziah. His name spread abroad, even to the entrance of Egypt, for he grew exceedingly strong. Moreover, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and at the turning of the wall, and fortified them. He built towers in the wilderness, and dug out many cisterns, for he had much livestock, both in the lowlands and in the plains. He had farmers and vineyard keepers in the mountains, and in the fruitful fields, for he loved farming. Moreover, Uzziah had an army of fighting men who went out to war by bands, according to the number of their reckoning made by Jael the scribe and Maaseiah the officer, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. The whole number of the heads of the fathers' houses, even the mighty men of valor, was 2,600. Under their hand was an army, 307,500, who made war with mighty power, to help the king against the enemy. Uzziah prepared for them, even for all the army, shields, spears, helmets, coats of mail, bows, and stones for slinging. In Jerusalem he made devices, invented by skillful men, to be on the towers and on the battlements, with which to shoot arrows and great stones. His name spread far abroad, because he was marvelously helped until he was strong. But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up, so that he did corruptly and trespassed against Yahweh his God. For he went into Yahweh's temple to burn incense on the altar of incense. Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him 80 priests of Yahweh who were valiant men. They resisted Uzziah the king, and said to him, "It isn't for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to Yahweh, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. It will not be for your honor from Yahweh God." Then Uzziah was angry. He had a censer in his hand to burn incense, and while he was angry with the priests, the leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in Yahweh's house, beside the altar of incense. Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they thrust him out quickly from there. Indeed, he himself also hurried to go out, because Yahweh had struck him. Uzziah the king was a leper to the day of his death, and lived in a separate house, being a leper, for he was cut off from Yahweh's house. Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first and last, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, wrote. So Uzziah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of burial, which belonged to the kings, for they said, "He is a leper." Jotham his son reigned in his place. Well, isn't this a shocker? There's another king here who doesn't quite do what he's supposed to do at the end of his life because he gets very arrogant. It says in verse 1 that all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old, and made him king in the place of his father Amaziah. Now, we just finished talking about Amaziah last week, and Amaziah started out again as a very good king. He tried to follow Yahweh in a lot of different ways, but then once God gave him success in a battle against the Edomites, he started worshiping the Edomite gods, and God gave him several warnings to stop what he was doing, or he would meet a bad end. Amaziah did not listen to the warnings and in fact was very belligerent against the warnings and kind of just did whatever he wanted to do. And it ended in his downfall, unfortunately, where Israel, the northern tribes, came and pretty much destroyed part of the wall of Jerusalem, went in and pillaged it completely, including the temple of Yahweh. But they didn't kill Amaziah. He was left as a disgraced king for many years after that, actually, until eventually a few of his servants actually conspired against him and killed him. But scripture alludes to the fact that Amaziah was not repentant even in the latter days of his life. So now Amaziah has been killed, and his son Uzziah, who is 16 years old, reigns in his father's place. And right off the bat, it says he built Elath and restored it to Judah. After that, the king slept with his fathers. So Uzziah was known for being a king that restored land back to Judah. He was actually a very successful king in the wealth of Jerusalem and of Judah as a whole. So we're going to talk about all that in just a second. It says in verse 3 that Uzziah was 16 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. So he reigned, I think, the longest out of any of the kings, if I'm remembering correctly. Maybe Solomon reigned longer, but I didn't look that up, so I can't for sure say that. But Uzziah certainly reigned some of the longest out of all of the kings in Judah's history. It says his mother's name was Jechiliah of Jerusalem. He did that which was right in Yahweh's eyes, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. Now, that's really important to note here, that yes, Uzziah did a lot of good things, and he did things that were good in God's eyes, but he did them to the same extent that his father Amaziah had done. Not to the standard that the kings were supposed to meet, which was David. We know that David was pretty much the most righteous king in Israel's history, and God told the kings to emulate David with what they did, basically walk in David's footsteps. And obviously we know that the most important thing David did during his reign was that he followed God his entire life and didn't try to make any idols for himself and didn't turn towards the gods of the nations. He only worshiped God in and out. It actually says that David was a man after God's own heart, which is why he was the standard for the other kings. There's only a few kings in Israel's history that says that they followed after the footsteps of David. But kings like Amaziah and Uzziah only followed after the good things that their fathers had done. But unfortunately, their fathers did some bad things towards the end of their lives. And Uzziah was one of those kings. He only did things to the same standard that his father Amaziah had done, unfortunately. It says in verse 5, though, that he set himself to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the vision of God, and as long as he sought Yahweh, God made him prosper. Now, the Zechariah mentioned here is an unknown Zechariah, but whoever he was a mentor of Uzziah. And he also must have been a prophet because he had understanding in the vision of God. And it sounds like Zechariah was a great role model because Uzziah set himself to seek God in all the days of Zechariah. It says, as long as the king sought Yahweh, God made him prosper. And that's a very important verse. Back in the days of the law, God would show himself through the prosperity of Israel. That was the way he worked. If Israel and Judah were in line with God, God would allow them to prosper. And the reason this was because Israel was supposed to be the light to the world. The nations during this time believed in a lot of different gods. They believed in a god of the fields. They believed in a god of the mountains, a god of the sky, a god of the weather, a god of the sea. They believed in all these different types of gods. And they thought that if they got on these gods' good sides, that these gods would bless them. And so that's why Yahweh would bless Israel if they were in line with him, because this would show the rest of the ancient world that Yahweh was the one true God. Because ultimately, when these foreign peoples are praying to their Baal gods or something like that, and Baal is not answering their prayers because he's a fake god, the people would look at Israel being very successful, and they'd be like, what God are they worshiping? Why is that God blessing them? And this God we're worshiping isn't blessing us. So as long as Uzziah was worshiping God, as long as he sought after Yahweh, it says God made him prosper, because Israel and Judah were a light to the rest of the world. And that is how God showed his power and his supremacy through the rest of the world. But not to mention, God loves his people, and he's going to bless those that love him as well. There's a verse in the book of James that says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. As long as Uzziah was drawing near to God, God would also draw near to Uzziah. It says in verse 6 that he went out and fought against the Philistines and broke down the wall of Gath, of Jebna, and of Ashdod, and he built cities in the country of Ashdod and among the Philistines. So in other words, Judah was expanding its border into Philistine territory, and God was actually giving Uzziah much success in this. When God first gave the promised land to the Israelites were supposed to take it for themselves, but they were never very successful in that because of their lack of faith in God's ability to help them. So they never quite took the land that they were supposed to take. And all of these people were living within the borders of Israel, who should not have been living there, quite honestly, because they were not Israelites. They were part of cults and worshipped pagan deities, and they had no claim to the land that God gave his people. So Uzziah was not wrong to take this land from the Philistines. Now, there are verses where God tells the Israelites that they're not supposed to expand their borders too much, because God gives pieces of land to each person, and God gave Israel to the Israelites. So they weren't supposed to expand their borders too much, but they were supposed to take their own land. Uzziah was successful in taking back some of the land for Israel. It says God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians who lived in Ger Baal and Meunim. The Ammonites gave tribute to Uzziah. His name spread abroad even to the entrance of Egypt, for he grew exceedingly strong. It says, moreover, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, at the valley gate, and at the turning of the wall, and fortified them. So not only is he successfully taking land back for Israel, but he's also building fortified cities all around as well, so that these invading armies can't easily take these cities back for themselves, because these walls kept people out. And notice that all of the glory in this is given to God, not to Uzziah. Yes, Uzziah obviously was the king and was doing all of these things, but God was the one truly giving Uzziah success. So in this entire passage, God is completely glorified because we know where success comes from. It does not come from ourselves. It comes from God. And then it goes on to talk about how intelligent Uzziah was as well. It says he built towers in the wilderness. He dug out many cisterns, for he had much livestock, both in the lowlands and in the plains. He had farmers and vineyard keepers in the mountains and in the fruitful fields, for he loved farming. I think that's really cool, actually. We get a little peek into Uzziah's life and his passions. And apparently, his biggest passion was farming. He loved it and he was good at it. It says, moreover, Uzziah had an army of fighting men who went out to war by bands, according to the number of their reckoning, made by Jael the scribe and Maaseiah the officer, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. And then it mentions this really bizarre number. And it says he had 307,500 who made war with mighty power to help them, or to help the king against the enemy. When I first read that number, I'm like, 307,500. 307,500? Like, I honestly could not wrap my brain around what this number was. So I looked up this number in the Expository's Bible commentary, and it says that this number was probably 300 professional soldiers, like warriors, together with 7,500 men trained for war. So in other words, elite soldiers and warriors and possibly spies. Uzziah set these men up to keep the peace for Israel. So he was very organized. He understood a lot about war, about farming, and he was beginning to make Judah very great. Once again, it actually says that Uzziah's fame spread, so much so that all of these neighboring nations are bringing him tribute because they didn't want him bothering them. They were scared of him. They didn't want to go to war with him, so they would bring tribute so that they didn't have to go to war, essentially. Not to mention, it also says that Uzziah prepared for them, even all the army, shields, spears, helmets, coats of mail, bows, and stones for slinging. In Jerusalem, he made devices invented by skillful men to be on the towers and on the battlements with which to shoot arrows and great stones. Now, this is super interesting because the first catapult that we know of in archaeological history was discovered about 200 years after the death of Uzziah. But it very well could be that Uzziah and his men were the ones who invented the catapult. Now, there is some debate on this text. Some people say that the Hebrew denotes more of a shield kind of defensive thing that would stop hurling rocks and arrows from penetrating the walls of these towers. So it could be something like that he invented, like a big shield. But if he invented the catapult, that's kind of pretty neat, I think. But the point of this is that God helped Uzziah. He was very successful in pretty much everything that he did. It says in verse 15 that his name spread far abroad because he was marvelously helped until he was strong. But when he was strong, verse 16, his heart was lifted up so that he did corruptly and trespassed against Yahweh his God, for he went into Yahweh's temple to burn incense on the altar of incense. Now we know that this was a wrong thing to do because only the Levites were allowed to be the priests. They were the only ones allowed inside the temple to offer incense and sacrifices to God. Here's what scripture says in Numbers 3:10. You shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall keep their priesthood, but the stranger who comes near shall be put to death. That is how strongly God cared about the Levites being the only ones to sacrifice to him. We've definitely talked about why that was, why the Levites were the only ones allowed inside the temple. So I won't talk about that here. But King Uzziah was never supposed to be in there because he was not a Levite. He was from the tribe of Judah. Not to mention, a king was never supposed to be a priest or a high priest because a king already had a bunch of power. There's a similar passage, actually, that talks about another king that tried to become a priest or a high priest. This is the account of 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 5 through 14. It says, the Philistines assembled themselves together to fight with Israel. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped in Michmash, eastward of Beth-aven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were distressed, the people hid themselves in caves, in thickets, in rocks, in tombs, and in pits. Now some of the Hebrews had gone over the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, but as for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. He stayed 7 days, according to the time set by Samuel. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal. Saul said, bring the burnt offering to me here, and the peace offerings. He offered the burnt offering. It came to pass that as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him, that he might greet him. Samuel said, what have you done? Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that you didn't come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines assembled themselves together at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down on me to Gilgal, and I haven't entreated the favor of Yahweh. I forced myself, therefore, and offered the burnt offering. Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded for you. For now Yahweh would have established your kingdom on Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not continue. Yahweh has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept that which Yahweh commanded you. So that's the story of King Saul, the first king in Israel's history, who sacrificed the offering to Yahweh when he should not have. And the reason he did this was because he felt that he was losing power. So he tried to gain power for himself by becoming the high priest in place of Samuel. And Samuel said, because you did this foolish thing, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you. And that's essentially exactly what Uzziah did in 2 Chronicles 26. It says his heart was lifted up. He became prideful, kind of like his father Amaziah had done after his successful battle. Uzziah became prideful and wanted more power for himself. And the way a king could get more power was becoming the high priest. But the king was never supposed to be the high priest because the king could not have absolute power. And that's what being the high priest would give the king. Power over everything religious and power over the people and the foreign affairs and the politics and all that stuff. The king could not have absolute power. The priesthood was for the Levites to take care of, and the Levites only. It was not for anybody else, especially not the king. And Uzziah, trying to take more power for himself, just belligerently, blatantly goes into God's temple and starts offering the incense to God. It says the priests took courage and went after Uzziah. It says they resisted him. It mentions that these priests were valiant men. That means that they were courageous, because I'm sure they were scared of the king. I'm sure they didn't want to confront the king. But 80 priests went after him, including the high priest who was named Azariah. They confront Uzziah inside the temple and they say, you got to get out. This is not for you. Here's what they say. It isn't for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to Yahweh, but for the priests, the son of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn the incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed. It will not be for your honor from Yahweh God. Here's how Uzziah responds. He becomes angry. It says he had a censer in his hand to burn the incense, and while he was angry with the priests, the leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in Yahweh's house beside the altar of incense. I've been really talking a lot recently about how God does not judge people very often without giving them a warning first. He does not just strike people, he usually warns them. Uzziah got his warning right here from the priests. And I wonder if he had humbled himself and been like, wow, you're right. I shouldn't be doing this. This is not for me to do. I have sinned against Yahweh. I wonder if God would have had mercy and not given Uzziah this terrible form of leprosy. But unfortunately, that is not how Uzziah responds. Instead, he becomes angry with the prophets. And that is when God strikes Uzziah, was when his heart was against God and against the commandments of God. That is when God strikes Uzziah with this leprosy. It says, Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead. And so they thrust him out quickly from there. Indeed, he himself also hurried to go out because Yahweh had struck him. So he was humbled immediately. Immediately. Uzziah the king was a leper to the day of his death and lived in a separate house, being a leper, for he was cut off from Yahweh's house. Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. So because Uzziah got struck with this nasty form of leprosy, and this wasn't like the leprosy that would go away, this was like the bad form. He had to live in a separate house according to the laws of God because leprosy was very contagious. And, the priests didn't want that inside the temple to God. And they basically grab Uzziah and throw him out of the temple. But he was right along with them. He was hurrying to go because he realized that he had just been struck by God. And unfortunately, Uzziah followed in his father's footsteps. He became prideful in his success and started going against the commandments of God. Amaziah, his father, did that by worshiping Edomite gods, but Uzziah did this by trying to become a godlike figure himself, gaining absolute power for himself, and not obeying the commandments of God. Now it says the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first and last, Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, wrote. So Uzziah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of burial, which belonged to the kings, for they said, he is a leper. Jotham, his son, reigned in his place. So unfortunately, because of Uzziah's sins, he was not allowed to be buried with the other kings. He had to be buried in this separate field because leprosy was so dangerous and contaminating. So they didn't want his body even to contaminate some of the tombs of the kings. This is an unfortunate end for such a great king. And it shows once again that pride really does come before the fall. Faithful listeners, I'm going to play an ad for you guys, and right after that, I'm going to give you some closing notes. It's really important to read chapters like this, these historical chapters, because they teach us a lot, especially when it comes to this topic of pride. Pride can cause so many issues in our lives. It is really the root of all evil. In both Amaziah's case and Uzziah's case, their pride caused them to start worshiping something that was not Yahweh. They had forms of idolatry in their hearts, even though their forms of idolatry looked very different. Amaziah bowed down to foreign gods. Uzziah bowed down to himself and was immediately humbled in the end, where God said, you can't even rely on yourself when I strike you with this leprosy. Because what happens to Uzziah right after that? He can't even really be the king anymore. He's got to live in this separate house, and his son Jotham becomes the king in his place, essentially. It says in verse 22 that he lived in a separate house. He was cut off from Yahweh's house, and Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. God took pretty much everything from Uzziah in the end when his heart became so arrogant and so prideful. In fact, on the Bible Explained on Fridays, I just went over a similar topic with the members, Psalm 75, where God is going to humble the arrogant people that lift their heads against him. And that, unfortunately, is what Uzziah did. So we need to learn from passages like this in our own lives so that we don't make the same mistakes, especially if God starts to help us and we become complacent, expecting more from God, or just downright arrogant because of all the success we end up having. All right, faithful listeners, I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I'll see all of you guys on the podcast tomorrow, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up and listen. Happy listening, and God bless. I just want to take a second to thank the team at LifeAudio for their partnership with me on the Bible Explained podcast. In fact, if you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.